Okay, I hope you guys could hear me. Let me just share my screen. I'm sorry I cannot be with you guys in class today, but COVID has taught me one thing is that you're still able to teach even when you can't be present. And this is how we're going to kind of do it. So you're just going to be watching this video of me. I'm going to explain to you guys what you have to do after listening to my lecture. Please take out your notes, make sure if you need to pause this real quick so you can take out everything, but just take out your notes in preparation for this just quick lecture going over what the second Red Scare was and exploring the hysteria that was caused during this the Cold War. And we're going to kind of touch base on what we kind of talked about during the last lesson where I had you guys do that game where you had some people that were communists and some people that weren't, and you were trying to make those large groups. You guys were all screaming at each other, you're a communist, you're a communist. It was a really good simulation of what it was like to live during the 1950s, during the second Red Scare. And we're going to kind of look at that. So again, remember 1945, that man, Igor Gozvenko, he walks out of the Soviet embassy. He completely defects from the Soviet Union, and he reveals paperwork that shows that there has been a massive effort by the Soviet Union to have people invade, the governments and different organizations in both the US and Canada. And this causes a fear of subversion. And so what subversion is, it's secretly weakening society, so it's easier to overthrow the government. It's pretty simple. The fact that, if someone joins at the government position, they make laws or they do something like this, and it weakens society because maybe the laws are confusing or the laws are detrimental to society. And as a result, it weakens it so much so that it will become easier for someone to overthrow it. And Truman kind of responds to these fears by making federal employees sign loyalty oaths. This will become known as the Loyalty Review Program. This is kind of what an oath of allegiance looked like. And it does the opposite of what he intends it to do. He did it just to kind of ease fears, to say like, oh, hey, like, look, a bunch of people are saying we're not communists, we're good. No, in fact, it actually does the opposite. And it makes that fear and panic a lot worse because guess what? Oh my God, if the president is making us sign these, then he must know that there are potentially some people here and he's just trying to get them out. And it just cements that fear that, communists have already invaded our country and we're not safe anymore. And this leads to another action taken by another important figurehead during this time, a man named J. Edgar Hoover. I'm sure you've heard about him before. I hope you remember when we kind of talked about him in the 1920s. And he sends a lot of anarchists away during the first Red Scare. So look at that. He's around for both the first and second Red Scare. At this point, he's probably the most powerful man in the country. Being the head of the FBI, he has so many files on so many people, important figures. You could go through the FBI website and look at the files for important figures like Martin Luther King, Albert Einstein. They all were being investigated by the FBI. And what J. Edgar Hoover does is he creates the HUAC, which is called the House Un-American Act Committee. And this is created to investigate for both fascism and communism in the country. And he holds these hearings in a public setting. Now, what's big about this is because this helps spread the fear even more. See, we're making it saying we're going to hold all these investigations for communism, and now we're putting it in the public. That's not a good idea because people can misinterpret things. People could blow stories out of the water, or something could be revealed, errors in their investigations, and people could latch onto those errors, creating falsehoods. It just pretty much makes the hysteria and the panic around the second Red Scare even worse. And what's going to happen is we're going to see some cases where we really saw the hysteria get out of control. The first big case being the Alger Hiss case. So we have Whittaker Chambers. This is our man here. He is an editor for, give me 1 second, I haven't seen. Always come with notes prepared, even when you're doing a speech, because guess what? You're going to need them. But Alger Hiss, what he does is he's a Time magazine editor and former member of the Communist Party. So he is a former Communist Party member. What he does is he's going to testify at the HUAC, and he's going to say that, well, all these government officials, including Hiss, were former communist spies. Now, Alger Hiss, this is him right here, right? This is like dashing man right there. And Alger Hiss, he was a lawyer and he's a diplomat who served under the FDR administration. He attended the Yalta Conference and even helped organize the United Nations. He did a lot for setting up the world peace, and he did a lot for this country, you know. And this is big because he's such a big, important figurehead. So to find out that he's potentially a communist really shook the foundation of American society and its trust in the government. And so here's kind of how the events went down. So what happens is, you know, Chambers makes this claim, right? So what Hiss is going to do, he's going to sue for libel. And so when Chambers is in front of the grand jury during this case, he claims that Hiss gave him these secret documents from the State Department. So he's giving away secrets to a member of the Communist Party. Now, Hiss is going to deny everything, including knowing Chambers. He's going to say, I have no idea. I never met this man before, ever. I don't even know who he is. And this would have ended the case. It was actually coming to a close, but a future president, Richard Nixon, who was a representative of California at the time, urges for this to continue to find out who was lying, just to kind of put a bow on it and not leave it like an open-ended question, just to ease fears. And what's going to happen is now Hiss's actions go back on what he said, and he admits he actually did know Chambers already. So this kind of places like a little bit of a distrust in Hiss. And then Chambers is going to kind of continue off of this, and he's going to say, well, he's a communist, he's this, he's blah, 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 this, he's that, he's that, he's that. And so now this is going to cause Hiss to sue Chambers for him continuing to ruin his image by calling him this a communist, because it's ruining his image. I mean, being called a communist at this time takes away a lot of your reputation. And what Chambers in his defense is going to do is he's going to produce copies of these secret documents with microfilm. Microfilm is like, you know, when you think of those really old-fashioned movie projector things and they had like the reel, that's what microfilm is. It pretty much looks just like that. And they were hidden in a hollow pumpkin on his farm, and these would become known as the pumpkin papers. So if you're going to remember the Alger Hiss case, just remember pumpkin patch, pumpkin papers. They are the reason why Alger Hiss actually then gets convicted of perjury, which is lying under oath, and his reputation is forever in shambles, and he loses his status. There's a big case showing that, you know, this hysteria has notion, you know, and you could produce anything or you could say anything and will have some liable cause. And this actually goes into Hollywood, and a lot of actors, writers, producers, everyone really involved in Hollywood were the most targeted during all of this. And one of the biggest events was the Hollywood 10. And these were 10 screenwriters who refused I'm sorry, that says take, meant to say talk during an AU at you know, the HUAC hearing. And as a result, they get jail sentences, but they're also blacklisted. If you don't know what blacklisted is, think what happened with Colin Kaepernick, right? He stood for what he believed in, but not everyone agreed with it. And so now he's not being put on any more NFL teams, despite him being a free agent. Very similar. It's you get put out there, you're done. If you're blacklisted, your career is done. No one wants to hire you. No matter how talented you are, you're forever blocked and shunned out of whatever professional world you're in. So in the case of Hollywood, you're shunned out of Hollywood. In the case of Colin Kaepernick, he was shunned out of the NFL. It happens all the time. When you pretty much fight the system will strike down and unfairly isolate you from everyone, even if you're a qualified person. And another case of this happens with the Rosenberg. So remember I talked about that the Soviets get their hands through, get their own atomic bomb by having spies steal plans. Now this was a belief. This was a belief that this happened. What actually did happen was this man named Klaus Fuchs. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. It might be pronounced Klaus Fuchs. I'll say both just in case. He was a British scientist, and there's another thing. Jesus, he admits to selling the atomic bomb plants to the Soviets, and his testimony actually leads to the arrest of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, which he says were also involved in the process. They were spies that helped obtain the information, give it to me so I could sell it to the Soviets. So these are the people that supposedly gave away the atomic bomb plans. And what's going to happen is these Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they're known members of the Communist Party. So they self-identified as communists. It's what they believed in. Remember, communism is not entirely a bad thing. It's just people believed it was this very evil thing. And so what happens is the Rosenbergs are charged with heading the Soviet spy ring, despite them denying all of this, and they are executed on June 1953 for espionage. And a lot of people thought they were unfairly, put to death. Their trial was unfair because it was really on the basis of this hysteria that was going on during the second Red Scare. And just because they were communists, they thought that, well, they had such a hard bias towards wanting to condemn them to death. It's very similar to what happens with Sacco and Vanzetti in the 1920s, right? So we're kind of seeing the parallels between both the first and the second Red Scare. So please take note of that, right? Or it's almost history is repeating itself. We always talk about this all the time. History repeats itself. This is one of those cases. We're seeing a lot of events that happened, with J. Edgar Hoover doing a lot of big plays. We see people being unfairly, tried and being put to death because of their beliefs. It's literally, we're seeing history repeats. It's very fascinating looking at all of this. So now we got to talk about the big thing, specifically the biggest thing that comes from the second Red Scare. Man named Joseph R. McCarthy. This is our man right here. Check that out. Yeah, definitely looks like a man you can trust, right? And he's a strong anti-communist senator, and he comes in the spotlight in 1950. Now, before all this, McCarthy used this anti-communist sentiment to win a lot of the times. He beats his opponent saying, oh, well, he's a communist and I don't represent that. He just has a way. He had such a charisma that people believed what he said, and he influenced a lot of, his elections in his favor by claiming, oh, the other party, they're communist, they're anti-American, and it just worked in his favor. It's very similar to people like to compare Joe Rogan as a modern day Joseph R. McCarthy. Whether you believe that or not, that is up to you. But that's what people like to make the most modern correlations with, that they're saying Joe Rogan in his podcast is very similar to Joseph R. McCarthy. And we're going to talk about it. And so at a Republican women's group, he's making a speech. And during the speech, he says something very important. And he says, it's like around halfway through it, and he goes, well, I cannot take the time to name all the, let me put a space here. Geez, I'm so sorry. I thought I double checked that. Don't know what's going on, but he says, well, I cannot take the time to name all the men in the State Department who have been named as members of the Communist Party and members aspiring. I have here in my hand a list of 205 that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department. Now, that is big. He is saying right now that it's not just a few communist people that got into our government, but 205 people. The Associated Press is going to take this quote, and they're going to spread it all around the country. Every newspaper has this quote, and this makes him a superstar. This is the man that has the information that could pretty much uplift and destroy the entire Soviet spy ring. He knows all these secrets. He says he has this list, and he'll get off. There's a story. He gets off a flight to Denver, and when he gets off, he gets swarmed with press, and they're asking, hey, where's this list? Where's this list? He goes, well, I don't have it right now. It's in my luggage that's been left on the plane. And guess what? He never produces this list. It's a metaphorical list. He never produces it. So there's no proof of this 205 people that he, quote unquote, had a list for. But nonetheless, he becomes this big figure on anti-communism. And he's going to use this specifically with the McCarthy charges and McCarthyism. And with his new power, he's going to do many things. So during a bunch of HUAC meetings, he's going to be handing out booklets called the Party of Betrayal, and this accuses many Democratic Party leaders of corruption in protecting communists. And then he's also going to amass enough fear for Congress to pass the Internal Security Act, which is known as the McCarran Act. Now, with the McCarran Act, again, I am sorry for all these errors. I don't know what's going on. all Communist Party members or Communist Front organizations had to register with the Attorney General and publish the records. So they had to say, publish everything. There could not be any secrets. If you wanted to be a communist, you had to give away all your secrets. But he also identified communists were not able to get passports. So they weren't allowed to do international travel. That's big because, well, if they're international travel, they might be going back to Mother Russia and they're trying to, find all these secrets, bring it back to America and figure, try to undermine society. It just pretty much said, hey, if you're identified communist, you got to stay here. But what's big on that is now this also allowed for the arrest and detention of communist and communist sympathizers in emergency situations. But the government could manipulate any situation to be an emergency situation. So it pretty much allowed free reign to arrest anybody that was identified as a communist, whether they identified it themselves or if someone else identified them. It's very similar to what happens with Salem, with the witch hunts. We're going to actually mention witch hunt. It's very similar to what goes on pretty much with Nazi Germany, right? We're going after all these people of a certain belief, right? And we're saying, oh, well, it's for the protection of this country. Obviously, ours is not based in racism as the Nazi ideology is, but nonetheless, it's still based off of a strong communist ideology. So it's still just as bad because, these people are allowed to believe in what they believe in, but because we have this notion that communism is this evil thing trying to undermine us, we're going to be very ruthless to these people. And so we're going to lead to the biggest thing to come out of the Second Red Scare, which is McCarthyism. And what happens is in 1952, the Republican Party takes charge of Congress. They have more members sitting in Congress, and as a result, they become the majority leaders. And as majority leaders, they put McCarthy as the chairman on Senate Committee of Investigations. Now, this is big, which gives him the power to force government officials to testify about any alleged communist influences. But with that, he could accuse anybody, and he had a method of defaming these people, of ruining their reputation, right? And these investigations turn into witch hunts, and which is, a search for disloyalty to the American government based on flimsy evidence, irrational fears, based on nothing. It's based on like, oh, well, because I said so. Very similar to the witch hunts. And his tactic of damaging these people's reputations with vague and unfounded charges became known as McCarthyism. And, this tactic was when he would question people, he would badger them, like go into them, lay into them. Oh, you're this, you're that, you're that. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Like really just coming at you with a bunch of questions. You barely have time to react. And when they did answer, he would refuse to answer. Oh, you're lying. Tell us the real answer. Tell us the truth. And so imagine someone screaming at you to answer all these questions. And when you try to give an answer, they're saying you're lying. You tend to get mixed up. You tend to get flabbergasted. You get flustered. You are going to more than likely trip up your words. And that would lead a cloud of suspicion, which McCarthy and a lot of the people who believed in this cause would interpret as guilt. And a lot of people were unfairly deemed as communist, or they were deemed with false communist charges, and people would not speak up because they were afraid to challenge him out of fear of becoming a target themselves. And this is really what defines the reason for a majority of the Second Red Scare. And so McCarthy does get his comeuppance at the end of the day. Obviously, you can't go as far as McCarthy did with just false evidence with no real basis of evidence behind it. So what's going to happen is, McCarthy is going to have tried to see, well, are there communists in the military? And it's one thing you don't do with America, it's mess with the military, because that is our nation's pride. We do not mess with our military. And he's going to have these televised Army McCarthy hearings, which is what they're called. It happens in the spring of 1954, and millions of Americans are watching this event. And what happens is, his popular support actually started to fade. What happens is, to strike back at an Army lawyer named Joseph Welch, McCarthy brought up the past of a young lawyer in Welch's firm who had been a member of the Communist Front organization during his law school years. Now, Welch, who was well aware of this young man's past just goes off on this guy. And then he says, in quote, "Until this moment, I think I've never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" And spectators cheered. This pretty much tanked McCarthy's credibility, his popularity. And what's going to happen is later in the year, the Senate is going to pass a vote of censure, or it's also known as a formal disapproval against McCarthy. And it's one of the most serious criticisms that could be leveled against a member of Congress. And pretty much that makes his influence disappear. He disappears off of public view. He does remain in the Senate, but he had little to no influence because no one could trust him anymore. And then he dies in 57, as the textbook says, a broken and embittered man. So that's pretty much what happens during the Second Red Scare. It's really this idea of it's really an era defined by fear. There's no rationality. There's no logic. It's all emotion. And we see, we've delved into that before. We had a first Red Scare, and we still have similar incidents like this happening nowadays. We see what happened post 9/11 with this mass hysteria that we thought all people of Middle Eastern descent were terrorists. It's not true, but people tend to fall for fear during times of crisis. And this second Red Scare is one of those times where we just tend to fall and make the wrong decisions. But with that, you guys, I gave you an assignment to do with this. And what you're going to do is you're going to be looking at a bunch of different political cartoons, all centered around McCarthyism, the second Red Scare. And there's a question sheet. All you have to do, very simple, answer the questions for each specified political cartoon, turn it in, you're done, you get full credit. Pretty easy, not that hard. I think you guys could easily do it. So with that, thank you guys for your time. Use the rest of the time in class to work on this assignment with the political cartoons. And also, please turn in any work you haven't turned in yet. All right, so we could pick up those grades for all of you. All right, thank you very much, and I appreciate you guys for being understanding, for why I couldn't make it to class today. And I look forward to seeing you guys in person next class.